right. All right, welcome everybody. Happy afternoon. We are at the lot coverage work session, I believe, November 13, and I will pass it over to the manager for opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For this afternoon's work session, we're going to be covering two main topics. The first is the tree canopy assessment. The second is a review of impervious surface trends. And both presentations are going to give an overview of trends, both the recent and the longer term ones, about what's been happening in our residential neighborhoods. The presentations, I think, Libby, you took a look at them last night. You'll notice they're very data heavy, very graphic heavy. That's because, we try to visualize some complex and technical issues. I think the slides will go fairly quickly, but we will look to you for cues for where there'll be some natural points, I think, to take breaks, because there's a lot of material to get through. And at the end of the presentation, you're not going to see a specific recommendation from me about what comes next, but I'm hopeful that the presentation will at least lay out some of the complexities and trade-offs, both small and large, that you see on low residential development. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the tree expert, Dr. Vincent Verwey, who will walk us through the first set of slides.
Is that on? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the County Board, thank you for having me. I'm Vincent Verwey. I'm the County Urban Forest Manager, and let me pull up my presentation real quick. Let's see if I can pull that up. All right, so that's showing. That looks like it's showing. All right, thank you. And I don't quite have a doctorate yet, but I'll work on that.
You're a doctor in my mind.
Thank you. Today I'm presenting on the 2024 tree canopy assessment. This is the assessment done in 2024 of 2023, 2018, and 2014 tree canopy and their trends. We'll go through the background. We'll go through the canopy assessment. I'll give some localized examples of canopy change and our communications plan, and then our next steps. We are also joined by our contractor, Sandra Albro, who can help with any really technical questions if you have it that might be beyond my knowledge. So she might be able to intercede if you have any questions, but she's joining us online. So this, as a little bit of background, this study was guided by the Forestry and Natural Resources Plan, which you approved last year. Two major steps are related to this. Step 1.1.1 is to try to get us to 40% tree canopy countywide. And then step 4.1.1 triggered this study, which is to monitor changes in tree canopy every 3 to 5 years or more frequently. Davey Resource Group was contracted to perform this study and also do historical analyses of canopy in 2014 and 2018. And this tree canopy analysis used aerial imagery and something called light detection and ranging, which I'll get into, which is the industry best practice for monitoring changes in tree canopy and informing decision-making around conservation, planting, and outreach. I don't think I have to explain the benefits of trees, but that's why we do this. So I'm going to get straight to the results of this study. Yeah, I can pull this back. I hope that helps. We're going to go through the methods and accuracy of this study, then the tree canopy findings and comparison with prior studies. So first we used high-resolution aerial imagery from Arlington County's data, as well as USDA NAPE data, and what is called LiDAR data, which I mentioned earlier, which is elevation data. You can see an example on the right of this elevation data, which shows the heights of buildings and individual trees, which can be used to pull out trees and tree canopy and other features out of this data. And we get 7 land cover classes from this: tree canopy, grass and other vegetation, buildings, roads and railroads, other paved surfaces, bare soil, and water. And then we used the 12-foot cutoff for, no pun intended, for tree cover, and everything under that was designated as other vegetation. Here you can see an example of the different land cover types. You can see the recently redone Boston Pond with water, other vegetation. You can see buildings, pavement, and then in the darker green, the tree canopy that was pulled by this study. One really critical thing that we had that was part of this study is that we wanted to get to 99% accuracy for tree canopy. I'll get into some of the earlier studies later, but we really wanted to have a lot of faith and a lot of trust in the data that came out of this. So what our contractor did is use 1,000 random points to reference the existing imagery from what they used near map, Arlington County, that NAEP data that I referenced from the USDA, as well as the LiDAR data that we have. And they examined both false positives and false negatives. And they got to 2 different accuracies. Producer's accuracy of 99.2%, so those are points that appear in tree canopy in reference data and were correctly assigned. And if they were not correctly assigned, then either they reran the study or they had gotten past 99%. Similarly, the user's accuracy, so that's tree canopy, that's actually tree canopy in the reference data, is also 99.2%. These numbers are not always the same. This just happens to be the same in this case. We also analyzed tree counts, and this has some limitations to it because we're only looking at trees from the top down. This gets us individual trees that are standing by themselves or large mature trees that are really showing up in the overstory of our canopy. This probably underestimates the amount of trees we have, but can give us a good idea of how many mature trees might be in a neighborhood. I'll transition to the land and tree cover data now. This is the big reveal, I guess, of our land cover over the study period from 2014 through 2018 to 2023. So I'll point that out here. This first data point is 2014, 2018 over here, and then the 2023 data at the end here. You can see a slight increase in tree canopy over this time, but not quite at our 40% tree canopy target. We're at about 35% in 2023. A lot of this conversion comes from grass and other vegetation, so this is either people planting trees, but primarily it came from expansion of existing canopy. You can see some of the conversion from other surfaces, and I'll show you a different graph or a different way to look at this as well. A critical thing to understand here is that the impervious area reflected here is an undercount because this study focused on tree canopy. Any impervious area covered by tree canopy was counted as tree canopy, not as impervious area. So the study performed by DES would have the most accurate impervious data. This study should not be used for the impervious cover. This study should be used for the tree canopy cover. This is, I'd like to call this an abstract graph, and it takes a second to get used to look at this, but this will, every one of these things will be posted online for people to enjoy or print out in a large poster format. But what people can see from this is again the 3 years, 2014, 2018, 2023, and how these different land uses have converted from tree canopy to other uses. So I'll trace one. There's one from tree canopy to grass and other vegetation, one from grass and vegetation back to tree canopy, and so on. It also works with all the other land uses back and forth. We started creating maps with this data, and you can see the countywide tree cover. This is a map using 1 acre hexagons. 1 acre hexagons are a good way to disaggregate or not ignore, but get rid of the issues with political boundaries and really show how tree cover is distributed across the county. And you can see some obvious things like along the Potomac River. You can see some tree canopy cover and along the 4-mile run corridor with occasional spots where we have parks or the National Cemetery, for example, and some of the neighborhoods farther up north which have a higher tree canopy cover. But then also, for example, in Arlington Ridge, which is a southern neighborhood that has a decent amount of tree canopy cover as well. with this data, we can analyze change, and this might be hard to see in a presentation, but we can see individual change also again by these hexagons, and you can pull out individual examples of loss, gain, and what might have happened in those spaces and analyze what we can do in those spaces. We did the same thing. We made another, what we call a heat map of the tree quantities. So those are those mature trees and individual trees that we saw earlier on the slides. And then we started looking at the distribution by political boundaries. So we have civic associations, for example, with civic associations across the county, different civic associations showing that greater than 40%, which is what we're trying to get to across the county, and some civic associations which could benefit from additional trees. And this ranges from 8 to 70% of tree canopy cover. So it's a wide range, 8% down here at Foxcroft Heights to Arlingwood up north, which is about 70%. This is a change map, and one thing that's useful to see here, and you'll see a different way of looking at this in the next slide, is how we're seeing change between 2014 and 2023. So this is from a negative change. So reduction was found in Terra Leeway Heights and in Foxcroft Heights. It was not significant enough to really call this significant decrease, but there's evidence of some loss in those spaces. Up to 8.5% increases in some of these in some of these neighborhoods that are in the dark green on this picture. One thing I forgot to mention on the previous slide, this is Washington Golf and Country Club, which is not a civic association, and that's why it's not included in this map. But on the next slide, we have this arranged by census blocks. And this shows also how GIS can sometimes show data in different ways. This does show some areas where you can see decrease, sometimes even up to a greater than 5% decrease. One example is an area where we had some private development along Columbia Pike. That same Washington Golf and Country Club had a lot of tree removal as part of one of our renovations, and this is really showing up during this period. Now, one big difference from some previous studies performed by Arlington County is that one previous study showed a decrease in the past on private property, but we see fairly equal increases across the board. One item that we added to this as well, Arlington Public Schools actually kind of outperform some of the other land uses, so that's good to know, and we'll continue to work with them to identify places to expand their tree canopy, because there are schools which could definitely benefit from some. Then, of course, I have to show off the parks, being in Parks and Recreation, but our parks overall generated about a 6% increase in tree canopy, which compared to the private and other public lands is a 2% improvement beyond that. So one critical thing with this study was how accurate it is and how does it compare it with other studies. This is why we performed a historical analysis with 2014 and 2018, so we can have that apples to apples, sorry for the tree pun, comparison between those different years using the same level of accuracy. So some of the past studies performed by Arlington County, and this varies by study, but they had about a 95% on average accuracy. With this study, at 99% accuracy, we're more confident in these results. And with statistics, there is still error in this, but we believe that it is fairly low. So the accuracy can help explain it, but part of the explanation of the difference in these studies can also be seen from different qualities of aerial imagery used. And the aerial imagery used for some of the previous studies had a lot of issues with lean, as well as some of the studies did not use the LiDAR, the elevation data that I mentioned. And LiDAR can really help, and I'll show you more examples on the next slide. You can look at this water tower, for example. On this image, you can really see a lean on this image. And that can overestimate things like tree cover or other land uses. Here I'll show you an example. You can see that the water tower, which is just a useful thing to use because it's so tall, is really leaning quite a bit on this image. And on LiDAR imagery, or in the LiDAR elevation data over here, you can just see the footprint, which can help you pull out the exact footprint of that feature. Same thing with newer data, you have less of a lean, which is helpful, and you can still correct that with LiDAR data to help with that footprint. So this, similarly, you can sometimes see shadows, which also help. Those also get reduced by flying, usually at noon, usually in the middle of the year, which this image was captured close to that and close to the middle of the year. You can reduce shadows that way, but you can, again, use the LiDAR information to pull out those shadows and restrict them from the study. So I'm going to go through some examples of canopy change across the county. These are just some examples I pulled out that I saw were either interesting or dramatic. Well, maybe not dramatic, but it's just important to pull out. And these increases can come from tree growth and planting. The decreases can come from all kinds of sources: natural tree decline, storms, pests, diseases, development, and what I call property manager landscaping decisions. And that can be for good or bad reasons. We're not going to make any judgment on this. This just shows where those losses have occurred. So how to visualize this? So the way we've visualized this is in a light green. You can see canopy expansion and tree planting. So that's existing trees expanding and tree planting starting to show up in our studies. We can see in the orange-red, depending on how colorblind one is. I'm a little bit colorblind, so I'm just going to use both words there. You can see some of the loss of tree canopy cover in our studies as well. And then you can see the existing tree canopy cover in the dark green. So here's an example of increase. Of course, I have to highlight a park, but there are other examples as well. So Eads Park, which you will also be able to see in the video that we're releasing as part of the news release, has shown a lot of increases from tree planting and conservation of existing trees. You can start to see a little bit, there's some losses here. Every park has trees that are just at the end of their life or sometimes fail from storms as well. A good example of private and public, some of these increases were in places that people wouldn't normally expect them to be. Roslyn is a place people don't usually think of trees, but at the edge of Roslyn, we have development that has street trees and plaza trees that really expanded, as well as Hillside Park, which is one of our forested parks in Roslyn, still showing expansion despite having so many trees in it as well. One new project that's already showing up is Metropolitan Park. You can see some of the losses from the trees that we're taking out from this development, but you can already start to see some of the increases from planted trees, and the conserved trees as part of that project are still increasing in size as well. I'll show a little bit more of a blown up version of this, but Terra Leeway Heights was one of the examples of where there was an overall neighborhood decrease. So when you zoom into that, you can see some of the losses in red. You can see these are often not necessarily always associated with development. Sometimes it's removal from storms. Sometimes it's what I call that property manager decision. And we'll look into these spaces, particularly these two neighborhoods that have had a lot of loss, and see if we can assist with them with the Tree Canopy Fund or other resources on public property as well. Some transportation projects through expansion on I-66, and some projects that obviously were important to the county, but also had impact, like Columbia Pike's multimodal project, have had impact on our tree canopy. Luckily, we're working with VDOT to try to replant those spaces, and of course, we have our own tree replacement requirements as well. Arlington Public Schools has also a range of impacts. On the left, you can see a school, Glebe Elementary, with significant increases. And then on the right, Dorothy Ham showing a project that happened recently having some impact, but we're starting to see some regrowth of forested spaces and some new planted trees starting to show up in our study. Comparing to our surrounding communities, and this might be a little bit hard to see on there, but Gesundheit. We are comparing to Washington, D.C. and Alexandria primarily, as they are kind of similarly urban, even though they're different in many ways. We're slightly above Alexandria with its last study showing them having 33% tree canopy cover, and slightly below Washington, D.C., which benefits from a lot of federal property, big Rock Creek Park, places like that. Got my Rock Creek Conservancy cup over here. And spaces like that. But even if you were to take those federal properties off of DC's tree canopy cover, you'd see some real stresses in some of their urban areas as well. So kind of in the middle. If you start to compare to some of the less developed, I say less developed relatively, communities like Fairfax and Montgomery County, that starts to become a little bit more uneven. They are more into 50% tree canopy cover, but they have much larger parks and less dense development. So how can we use this? We can inform decision-making around conservation, planting, and outreach. We can identify those neighborhoods of need, some of the ones I mentioned, but also those places like equity areas. And I'll work with American Forests to get their data updated so we can use the tree equity score method that they use that's in the FNRP. And we can identify places where additional places could be created for tree planting, for example, by converting pavement to plantable space, which hopefully will tie into the next presentation as well. And then we'll coordinate with other planning documents, for example, the transportation plan update, which is ongoing, to understand comfort on streets and trails, and then hopefully measure again in the next 3 to 5 years to monitor our progress. We have a communications plan, so we'll have our website updated along with all the other social media and emails. And then we'll have a Forestry and Natural Resources Commission meeting where I'm sure I'll get to dig into some of the finer details of some of the results. And we will have a virtual community information session with a Q&A for the general public on December 12th. And that is it.
Excellent, thank you. I was indeed a little worried when I saw the number of slides. Very well done going through them.
Thank you.
No, I think well done. I think understandable and just the perfect amount of time, at least for this listener. Colleagues, any questions from Mr. Vervey? Or we could call him Dr. Vervey. All right, who wants to go? Who wants to go first? All right, go ahead, Ms. Coffey.
Yeah, I know you mentioned some of the federal lands in DC and how that, I think, positively impacts their tree canopy with Rock Creek Park. Can you talk about how things like the airport, the cemetery, and the Pentagon impact our tree canopy proportions in Arlington?
Sure, yeah, that's complex because we don't have a whole lot of influence on those spaces. Yeah. The National Cemetery, the last time I measured, and I haven't measured it as part of this study, they had about 40% tree canopy cover. They have a lot of trees. They have some amazing national champion trees on their property. So they're positively contributing. The airport is almost no trees except for kind of around the entrance, and that's a challenging place. I do not consider that to be a plantable space. That's much more challenging. Yeah, and
Help
even
with the airplane noise.
Yeah, even things like the pedestrian connection to the airport will have, unfortunately, a negative impact on our tree canopy along the GW Parkway, which is another federal property there. But the GW Parkway as a whole does contribute positively as well. And then you mentioned the Pentagon, which I think is still our biggest office building in the world or something like that. They do have a little courtyard with tree canopy in the middle, but that parking lot and the office building does not help. And we occasionally have some influence on that, but it's fairly limited.
Yeah, thank you. I'll pass along for now, but I might come back.
Takis, go ahead.
Thank you. On the same, so we have also these two country clubs, golf clubs, and you mentioned that, and it's true. They took down most of their trees in the last 10 years because they expanded the game use for that, the golf use for these. So we don't measure them at all. This is not part of our inventory.
No, everything in Arlington County is measured.
So they are in, so they.
Yeah, they were just not part of, sorry, the Washington Golf and Country Club is not in a civic association, so that's why it wasn't showing up on the civic association map. But yeah, we can see that loss on both of the golf courses. They have retained trees as part of during that time period, but with with Washington Golf and Country Club taking out a lot of trees for their redevelopment, and then just at-will removal is legal for them to do.
Yeah, I know that it's legal for them to do that.
Whether it's good is a different
But
question.
it was extremely aggressive. So they had the periphery of a lot of forested periphery around the club, and now it's completely gone. A fraction of that is left. So one question on the methodology and what we can still glean from this study. So what does the study tell us about the quality of the tree canopy? So what species we have, whether, how do we judge the age of the tree inventory, and therefore, what insights do we get about, what's the natural reforestation or succession system, ecosystem there. So what can we say about the health of our urban forests from what we see in the study? I was quite impressed by the fact that now we have an idea of how the tree canopy has been expanding from the same trees, basically, because they are maturing. But what else do we glean from the study in terms of the quality and the health of our?
Yeah, we could pull out height of the individual trees with the LiDAR data potentially. We do not get any information on species or composition or health. However, in 2016, we performed the iTree Eco study, which was a ground-up study using plot data to understand do a statistical analysis of the composition of our tree canopy. And we hope to do that again in the future. That will get us a better understanding of that. We have that for 2016, so we can understand to some extent what our composition and makeup is. To your other question about what we would understand about health, this ties closely to other items like our deer pressure and making sure that we have that understory in our forested spaces to recover any lost tree canopy that we have in those spaces.
Yeah, and what I'm after also is, for example, the elm trees have been decimated by Dutch elm disease, right? So or we had so climate change brings all sorts of biohazards with that. So if you don't have enough of a biodiversity in your ecosystem, then you have more points of exposure. So a single disease can be decimating, way more than one would be able to handle, right? So this is why I'm asking that. Do we have any insight on, is that a diverse, resilient urban forest, or if not, where are the weaker points?
Yeah, we can work with that 2016 data and any future analysis to do that. And then what this data shows us is whether we're recovering enough to meet our quantity goal. So the other studies would tell us more about quality that you're looking for.
Okay.
But there are several FNRP steps which speak to that quality, trying to get a high percentage of native trees in our planting palette, as well as working on deer pressure and plantable space on our development projects as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To my right, Ms. Cunningham?
On page 15, can you help me understand the definition? So like if a building has a green roof, would it show up most likely in the grass category in the new data analysis?
I might have to ask that to our contractor. Okay. Sandra, are you able to answer that question?
Hi, yes, and I'm also joined by my colleague Will Ayersman and a couple of other members of our GIS department. I invite them to chime in as well. The order of operations kind of would dictate how a green roof would show up. So tree canopy was defined first, and then buildings were defined kind of after that. And grass and vegetation was defined last as all of the area that was not previously defined. So I believe a green roof in that instance would show up as a building. Will or Nick, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, green roofs we did classify as grass.
Oh,
Was grass. Okay, great.
so that would be grass and other vegetation in this analysis.
Good.
Thank you.
I remember in remote sensing, I learned that that since we have the scanning of the buildings, if grass is on top of the building, since we have the scanning of the building, so we know where a building is. So then when it's a green roof on top of that, then it is identifiable as a green roof just by the difference by the overlapping with the building footprint.
Yeah, it depends on how you set your measurements. Obviously, this wasn't a green roof measurement study, so, but I'm glad to hear that they were pulling out that vegetation on top of buildings as well.
Good. Susan, anything more?
I'll bake on that for a little bit. I have some more later.
Okay, Matt?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Chair Libby, if that's okay to say, Chair Garvin. So the question, I'm trying to pull back out to get the big picture. You said we have another session in about a month, is that correct? Or?
I have a Forestry and Natural Resource Commission session next week, and then we will have a public session which will allow people to submit questions ahead of time, which I can address to the public at that time on December 13th.
Great. So that means I'm going to try and see if I understand the big picture here. We have a much better method of measuring our tree cover, which indicates that we've had, our previous count might not have been quite as accurate. We're planting trees fairly consistently over the last 10 years, and we are not at 40%, but we may have increased from 10 years ago somewhere in the lower 30s, a little towards the mid 30s. I'm just trying to see if I've got the big picture correct.
That's what the study seems to show.
Okay, got it. And then, so that's one question, and then the other is just to see if I got a point on getting it right. Ms. Coffey's question you answered, in both the studies, are those fully included, the Reagan, Arlington Cemetery? They're all included.
Yes.
And so that puts us, it's the 40% is in the other areas of our county may be a bit challenging because of on the maps, the flat white spaces where there are not many trees at Reagan. And you said Arlington National Cemetery, my experience, it has a lot of trees, but it may not be 40%. Have I got that part of the big picture correct on Arlington and Reagan?
Yeah, we do have the disadvantage of having an airport inside of our boundaries, and we'll have to balance that with the rest of the community and go above 40% in certain spaces to be able to reach that countywide 40%.
Great. I may have one more question later, but not now.
That's right. I think we'll do a second round, but I'll ask one. Really cool presentations. You can see so clearly what's happening, and I think that really helps because there are lots of times assumptions, but sometimes those are correct and sometimes they aren't, so about what's going on. So that's really helpful. I assume it's not calibrated to do this now, this system, but could it be calibrated to monitor our benefits requirements? So when we approve buildings, when we approve things, there are requirements for trees they're supposed to plant, and then years go by and maybe those trees survive and maybe they don't, but people can just, or maybe we just kind of forget they're gone, or is there a way to kind of put into this so that when we do the study, there's a monitoring of where, they were meant to have some trees and they've gone, we need to go back and get them to plant those trees. Could we do that to monitor and get some better compliance possibly?
That would be useful for a place where we have the regulatory authority to do that, like on site plans, and especially with some of these projects where we're allowing trees on roofs, we might not be walking by all the time or noticing those spaces. Yeah, that is a tool we could use, or
It's-
something we could use.
Yeah, because it's, I mean, you can't expect people to just keep track of, I mean, it's hard to do, but if you've got a computer that can just do it for you, and every 3 to 5 years when there's a study, things might show up with red flags, then that knows where we should go back and see if we can get the trees planted. Maybe they're doing fine, which is great.
Yeah.
Then maybe we send them a nice letter saying, it looks really great, thank you. Okay, I mean, do the carrot and the stick too. All right, I'll start back at the other end. Maureen?
We loop back. I think Mr. Karantonis' questions about, species and diversity and all of that kind of raised another question to me about the many different ways we can measure the importance of trees. And I think looking between the tree cover hexagons and the tree count hexagons, is there a way that we should be thinking about, the ideal portion of tree cover versus the ideal density in terms of quantity of trees? Because obviously you could take down a tree and have growth of new trees that offset, but is that in terms of environmental benefit truly offsetting?
That's a good question. That really gets beyond this, because this is such a top-down analysis. And if somebody had a large canopy tree and a dogwood underneath and they took that tree out, you might not see that. But that's exactly where we get the greatest benefit from a forest that has all of those layers intact, all the way from the herbaceous all the way to the top canopy. But we would also start to see this over time if we don't have that regeneration underneath. We would start to see trends where a big tree was taken out and it's not getting regenerated with a large tree. We might even be able to see that on this 10-year scale. But yeah, the ecosystem services are reduced when you don't have those different layers.
Yeah, so you do think that's something we could track with that over time, kind of monitoring, that we're not gonna miss out on that as long as we keep coming back and looking at?
I think it probably ties more into the study that I
study.
suggested
Okay.
to Mr. Karantonis, where we analyzed the quality of our urban forest using either iTree Eco or another method to really get the full ecosystem benefits. But we get great benefits from just knowing what our canopy cover is, because it is intercepting stormwater, casting shade, providing habitat, et cetera.
Yeah, great, thank you. And then last question, I think. We have an overall goal of 40% tree canopy as kind of averaged across our entire community. But I think we had talked about some, realistic sub-goals depending on the type of area, neighborhood, census block. Can you talk a little bit about, what differences we think are okay to see in terms of tree canopy in more urban areas like Ballston versus what we want to see in our parks and forests and things like that?
Yeah, obviously all these spaces benefit from trees. This is why in the FNRP it gets more granular about this. And there was a recent release by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which started to break down those different types of areas. And please don't quote me on these numbers, but I think in some of the more urban areas, it's around 25% instead of, that's not 40%.
Yeah.
But that's still ambitious for a place like Roslyn, which is probably around 15 right now. And then in some of the less urban areas, the lower residential areas, we would be looking at 55, 60% to make up for that difference, because they have a lot more plantable space. But we do have to look at modern technologies like planting trees on roofs, which comes with a lot of challenges, but can also provide a lot of benefits for the residents that live in those, as well as the ecosystem services that those provide. Does that answer your question?
No, it definitely does. I think sometimes
Okay.
the 40% can mask or set, different expectations where it might not be achievable. And it's not that we want every single neighborhood to have 40% exactly, but
Right.
it's that as things move up and down, the whole community overall reaches 40%.
And to your point, we also have to look at equity across the county. So if there are 10 communities that are at 80% in North Arlington, and that averages our entire county to 40%,
It's not
that's not
fair.
equitably
Yeah.
distributed. So we have to look at that across the entire space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Takis?
Thank you. So one thing that, I really appreciate the 3 slides that show tree cover, then tree cover by civic associations and census blocks. What I observed is that in our northern part, so close to McLean, where in 2023, we had, fairly high scoring tree cover percentages. Then immediately after that, these are also the places where they are the weakest in the increase. So they may not decrease, but they are significantly weaker than others. And across the board, actually the entire, So I see there already the public perception that, private owners, they are, not really replacing the tree count, because this 1 to 3% increase includes the natural expansion of the tree canopy from existing trees that may have, be spared the reduction. So I see there a first take that these neighborhoods, despite strong advocacy for maintaining nature in all in across the entire county, they are also the weakest performers here, and that concerns me. And I want to ask you whether my perception is logical. Do I see that right? Or
Yeah, it's in spaces where there is a lot of tree canopy, there's less opportunity to expand that tree canopy, even though it is expanding by its nature, just the trees growing. But if you already have 70% tree canopy, there are not a whole lot of holes that you can fill in there. So that could be one perception. I'd have to do deeper analysis of those specific areas. But yeah, the other perception could also be it's just barely keeping up with the loss in those spaces. So that would have to be a granular analysis in places like Williamsburg and Yorktown.
Right, because for example, I saw Arlington, for example, brilliantly performing, like 30-40%, and they have greater than 6% increase, practically great. Why? Because it's relatively steady, right?
Well, actually, we've had a fair amount of die out, and then there are little baby trees that get planted. So that's part of the whole cycle. But you can see that there. Yes, I was pleased to see Fairlington looking so green. Susan.
I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this question. Back on page 15, so we've made a decision where trees come first and then grass is sort of what's left over, with the exception of green roofs, which I think we've pulled it out. Is that, so if I add the grass and the tree canopy together for each of these years, that's a relatively stable number. Is that in part like, I guess, should we celebrate that our tree canopy is larger if our tree canopy plus vegetation overall is pretty much steady? And we've made a decision in how we've assigned tree canopy to say if it looks at all like a tree, it gets to be called tree and everything else is grass, right? Like, so does it actually sort of say, well, we may be changing the definitions a little bit, we're pretty much constant across time?
I think that speaks more, those numbers added together speak more to the plantable space overall, including where the trees already exist. That's a complex question. I'm not sure I can fully answer that. So for example, in 2014, 26, 38, 58%. Yeah, that's very close to the 57% if you add these numbers together. And that goes into the dynamic of impervious area too. If we had a lot more impervious area, we would not be able to easily recover that space into either grass and other vegetation or tree canopy. And even though I'm the urban forest manager, other vegetation also has a lot of ecological value. So I don't want to underplay that as well. But yeah, it speaks to how much opportunity space we have, because the grass and other vegetation spaces are the easiest places to vegetate. They may also be recreation fields or golf courses that are harder to vegetate with trees or other vegetation. But yeah, that's the space I look at first when I'm looking for opportunities.
Great, thank you.
Matt?
Thank you. The slide on how can we use this canopy analysis, I think it's slide 38, but I don't know, exactly where the numbering starts. I think those are very helpful recommendations, and I'm looking forward to, as we formulate the budget next year, kind of thinking through and trying to translate these into where we can make investments in the budget. Those in the room, both staff, board members, and also the advocates in the room will crystal clear know that we did significant investments in trees in the last year's budget, as do you. So, but I do think it's worth saying for the 15 to 50 people who are watching and will watch this over time, we did $1 million. We changed our tree maintenance program. We did an extra $1 million. It was the most significant that I know of fiscal investment in trees in, I think, the 5 years that I've been on the board. So that's I think, relevant. It's probably not, we'll talk later about the regulatory changes that are implicit in the tree discussion. I guess I'd just conclude by saying that really would love it if we picked up from last year's budget with these recommendations and thought about where there are strategic investments on trees that would be next, since we changed our tree maintenance cadence and since we've also done some other things. Would just love to, as we work on the budget, and given the tightness of the budget, it would probably be one time, I would think, but are there strategic investments that fall under these, how we use this tree canopy investments? And that's, poor you, that's an imponderable that's also directed towards the county manager a little bit as a comment and towards colleagues as we look at the budget next year. But thanks very much, Dr. Vincent, for the
Thank you.
All right. I don't think I have a question. Just a couple of observations. The green roof question, I think, is really interesting, and we may want to start following that more, because as we do more, if we get more green roofs, I mean, over time, that could really have an effect on just the climate and what we have here. When I was in Germany looking at the green roofs that they do there, it was really interesting. They remarked about how when the roofs are first there, there's not a lot of biodiversity in the form of different insects and bugs that live there. But actually, then they were doing studies, and after like 3 to 5 years, there was an explosion in all the diversity and kind of insects, so that it starts to develop its own ecosystem, which we might tend to devalue, but anyway, I'm just tossing out that might be something to continue to follow, and you might be following that. One day, maybe, the Pentagon parking lot will start to have trees. It always seems to me kind of crazy that it doesn't. This might not be the era to do that and to push, but I think at some point that just makes such incredible sense. They'd be so much more comfortable in their cars when they get in them after they've been in the shade, but that's just an observation that I think will happen at some point. Finally, in talking to people, I mean, some of those civic associations have more trees than others, and one in particular I talked to, apparently people in the neighborhood are not really interested that much in planting trees. And I think there are a variety of reasons, which I will go back to my mother, my niece, who's looking out at the fall leaves, and she's, oh, the leaves are all falling again, you've got to rake them. And that's what she thinks about, is the work involved with raking the leaves. And there are people that look at it, the trees are a pain. You got to rake the leaves, the acorns fall down, or they've got fruit or whatever. And that's a sort of cultural and maybe somewhat old-fashioned, when you didn't have to worry about having trees, but that might be something we're fighting as well. So I think the summation of all of those sort of odd catch-all comments is it's a multi-pronged effort that we're going to be doing, and it's really great to be able to trace what's going on. Mr. Schwartz.
Yeah, I was going to ask Vincent if he could take a minute to talk about there's a lot of data behind this information, and so how that data is going to be posted, because I know people want. I know when Vincent gave me the presentation, I said, so Vincent, let's go to my house and show me what's going on. There are some limitations, but I want to try to set expectations, because there is a lot of detail here. But Vincent, why don't you talk about what information, what layers will be available for people to look at?
Sure. Worked with our GIS department or section to have one of the interactive maps, or one of the maps shown as an interactive map, the Civic Association map, where you can look at the changes over time and compare it with your neighboring civic associations. But just like the previous data from previous studies, we'll be posting all of the GIS data on our OpenGIS layers, as well as add them to our public-facing maps, so you can cross-compare between 2014, 2018, and 2023. And then the new, something new that we'll add is that change map that you saw with the different colors, the green, the light green, and the orange red. So hopefully that will help people look at their property, hopefully not shame their neighbors for taking their trees off, but that is something you would be able to see if there's been a lot of loss and where that loss has happened in your neighborhood.
Oh, that's great. I like the red dots. It makes you think of measles, and there's something not right going on. So, colleagues, we've got another large presentation. I think we'll move on if that's okay. And I hate to leave the trees which feel comparatively soft and cuddly and lovely to the hard impermeable surfaces, but that's what we need to talk about next. And I know Jason will make it as friendly as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is really incredible work. Thank you very much.
Over to you, Professor Papakosma.
All right. Thank you for the honorary doctorate, Mr. Schwartz. I'm going to make sure the team's gods are cooperating here. Let me make sure this works. It's thinking. Okay, it's coming. Great. Okay, good afternoon, members of the board. I'm going to walk us through now a conversation about impervious surface dynamics and trends on low residential lots over time, why it matters and where things stand today, and then possible actions moving forward. We're going to start with the big picture. So we've been talking about tree canopy data, and as Vincent mentioned, we track impervious surfaces as well, directly through our geographic information system. And the big picture here is impervious surfaces in the county have been slowly but steadily increasing over time. And more of the increase is unregulated by the LDA program than is regulated. Now, I know we've talked about the LDA program today. I think people in the room mostly know what it is, but for people online or watching later, it stands for Land Disturbing Activities Program. It's our program that we use to regulate construction activity as well as manage stormwater runoff from development activities.
And it's tied to federal regulation, right? It's something that we're sort of permitted to do, I believe.
Yeah, it's federal, but it's also state, and what the state allows us to do is to regulate down to a much lower threshold than the federal regulations. So we regulate above, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, 2,500 square feet of land disturbance. So more of the increase of impervious surfaces is unregulated by the LDA program than is regulated. And of the activity that we regulate, single-family homes are the largest and majority source of those impervious surface increases. So we're focusing today on low residential areas because they're really important when it comes to stormwater and urban tree canopy, both today and in the future. The lots that are zoned low residential represent approximately 70% of Arlington's private land. The other important context I want to provide up front, to continue what we just talked about a minute ago, is a snapshot of how impervious surfaces are and aren't regulated in the county. So the LDA program, as I mentioned, regulates land disturbance above 2,500 square feet. This captures mainly new homes. Most home additions and improvements are below this threshold and not regulated by the LDA program. It also doesn't set actual limits on impervious surfaces, but it does require mitigation of runoff impacts from those surfaces. Zoning regulates building and driveway footprints, but does not regulate most walkways and patios, and we're going to talk about that in more detail as we move through this. So with that introduction, in the next slides, we're going to explore these three main questions when we looked at our low residential lot data, starting with how has impervious cover changed over time? It's a little bit busy here, and what I want to say up front, so these data come from our stormwater utility system. So our new stormwater utility that we set up, one of the things that we did that we're doing now that we weren't doing before is capturing these walkways and patios on residential lots. Previously, we were capturing just the building footprint and the driveway footprint, but not these other surfaces. So this additional granularity has been really helpful to drill down into these dynamics over time. So for orientation, each dot represents the median impervious surface coverage in a given year for each impervious surface type that's shown here. So again, we have buildings, driveways, walkways and patios, and then overall impervious as well. And this is data that I think supports, sorry about that, what I think is intuitive to most people, and that is that impervious surface coverage on these lots has increased over time, and that the building footprint, most of the increase is coming from larger building footprints. Some other interesting trends here is you can see how what I plotted here is this 10-year moving average, and what's happened before World War II was sort of interesting. They had sort of this scatter and then a decline, and then this steady increase upward. And we'll look a little bit more at that, but that stuck out at me as interesting when I was looking at these data. So we're going to go a little deeper into this data. We're going to focus on R6 and R10 lots. So going into specific R zones is more useful because there's much less variation in lot size than looking at all lots together. And these lots comprise most of the R zone parcels in terms of number and area. And specifically, and just think about this as we move forward, R6 lots are most of that. So most of the lots in the low residential zones are zoned R6. And as we look at the data, we have a baseline reference period that we established. And this is a little arbitrary, but when I looked at the data, the period 1935 to 1960 stuck out. 60% of all parcels have a year-built date in that time frame. And then present day, I looked at 2014 to 2020. That's about 5% of all parcels. So zooming in here to our baseline period, 1935 to 60, compare it to present day, we've got, and this is our 6 lots, similar themes to the overall data set. Total impervious cover and building footprints have increased. And I want to call attention to the higher present day impervious coverage levels as we look more closely at what this means. But in the present day period, median values are about 45% of the lot is impervious. For R10 lots, it's similar. You're seeing this upward trend. I'll just toggle back for a second. You're seeing an upward trend. The overall coverage is a little lower. The lots are a little larger. A little more scatter in the data as well, you can see over time. But again, you have in the present day period, larger footprint of buildings and overall impervious area on R10 lots. Okay, so we're going to look at the data a little bit differently now. So this is, again, the 2 periods that we've been discussing. This is footprint area as opposed to percentage of the lot covered, just another way to think about it. And what I've highlighted here is for both R6 and R10, the building footprint has increased the most. You got almost 50 to 60+% increase in the building footprint. In relative terms, the walkway and patio footprints have also increased, but the building footprint is the main headline in terms of these 2 different time periods. And then when you look at it as percent of lot area, it's a similar story. Headline is the same about building footprints have increased substantially, while the other features as a percentage of lot coverage have remained relatively constant. But we're going to talk more about why that walkway patio portion has become increasingly important. Okay, so we're going to move on to our second question, and that is how is impervious coverage compared to lot coverage limits? And this could be, this is a larger conversation with more complexity to it, but what I wanted to do here is just provide a quick summary of the key differences between the 2 measures. So I've included the definition of impervious surface from Chapter 60, and then a sort of Venn diagram of the main differences. And the bottom line here is that walkways and patios are impervious surfaces that are not counted as zoning lot coverage under most circumstances. And what this means, and I think we've talked about this previously, there are no real regulatory guardrails to prevent much of a lot from being paved. So this is just a quick reference point as we move through the next set of slides, zoning lot coverage limits by zone. And I've flagged the base lot coverage and then the max lot coverage with limits for bonuses for front porches and detached garages. And this data will carry through. I just wanted to put it here as reference. So back to the bar graphs we looked at earlier with a percentage of coverage of a lot by these What I've added here are reference lines for base and max lot coverage in orange. And I've also included not just median data, but 75th percentile, just to get a sense of what's happening above the median. So this slide is about R6 lots. And the main takeaways here, when I was looking at the data and putting this together, are that for most older homes, the impervious area is less than lot coverage limits. And you see that in that lower bar graph. Both median and 75th percentile are below even base lot coverage. When you look at present day, the median and 75th percentile, I should have practiced that a little more, 75th percentile exceed lot coverage limits depending on whether you're looking at base or max. And the walkway patio portion is really the main reason why you're seeing that additional footprint coverage above the lot coverage limits. Right, the one that's not regulated. And then when you look at our 10 lots, same dynamic here, same takeaways. The walkway patio portion is the main reason why most newer homes appear to be exceeding base lot coverage. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground fairly quickly. I've thrown multiple types of graphs and charts at you. Built in a break here for questions if you want to take it.
I think that's great, thank you.
I want
Yeah.
to use that slide in the future for everything.
Break for questions?
Break for questions, sure. I'll start at the other end to start with, if that's all right. Susan, do you have a question?
Go ahead.
Matt?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can try and sort of cover us a little bit from now. So in our zoning code, or do we have written policy that tries to, and sorry, this may not be for Professor Papacosma, but maybe whoever it is, and I actually don't know the answer to this. I know in my mind, but there's environmental benefits is the broad, and then flooding and water quality. Do we have something in our code that tries to identify the specific benefits of pervious cover?
Impervious, benefits of
well,
impervious or whatever. Yeah,
Either way,
yeah.
just something that says, because I feel like when we discuss this, sometimes there's different ideas of the benefits here. And I'm wondering if we actually say it or if we don't. I see the definition of impervious, but I don't know if we set forth our policy reasons in any documents that we have. And that maybe you can phone multiple friends, you guys can get back to me. I don't know the answer to that off the top, and I think I probably should.
It's a good question, because the other slide had all of the benefits of trees, which we all know, and then, yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, processing a little bit. It is a good
Yeah.
question. At least on the sort of the stormwater side of the house, I think about our stormwater ordinance or the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance. They all set forth, and these come from state code. What are the goals? Protecting water quality. To some extent, they talk about public health. They talk about ecological values. And again, the reasons why these codes exist. The purpose of this code or these codes are to do the following. I guess my question back to you, though, just to make sure I understand it, are you getting maybe more specifically into kind of how it talks about impervious and impervious surfaces directly? Is that where your question was going, or not necessarily?
No, I can't help but thinking of in the last 6 months, the volunteer who's gotten the most attendance, Caroline Haynes, is in the back. Mr. Richardson said he retired so he could spend more time with the county board, as one of his relatives said that. And he is Mr. Lot Coverage in some ways. But they might say different things about what the purpose of impervious are. And so I don't think we should have done it. But I think as we go next, it might help us to try to clarify our policy drivers that underlie this, because that could lead to different policy ways forward. I'm not wedded to this, to defining in precise terms, because of the history of technocrats saying, oh, you don't quite qualify. That doesn't mean it should drive only policy, but I think we should consider whether we should try and set out what the policy reasons, and I can say some of them, but I don't know that I've captured them all. So there's no looking back. I just wanted to surface that thought.
Could I try asking it a different way? And sorry, no warnings on these questions, right? Could you compare, so the rain's coming down on this house, and there's not really any driveway or walkway or patio, what happens to the rain? And then new owner comes in, does a double driveway, big, huge old patio, big walkway, and all of a sudden when the rain falls, there's all of this impervious surface on the ground. What happens to the water? Is it different on the first house and then after it's had all the impervious surfaces allowed? I'm sure the answer is yes, but I don't know if you want to talk about how.
Yeah. Sure, yeah, I think the short answer is yes, it's very different. Basically, the rainwater has less space to soak into the ground, both directly where it falls, right, because now it's not pervious anymore, and then what runs off the rooftops if it's not managed, which of course under our codes we try to manage it, but if it's not managed, it also has less space to soak in to the ground in terms of where it might go. So there's that direct difference for sure.
And it ends up in the storm sewer.
Yeah, storm drain system and right on down to the nearest stream. Or in many cases, I think, to be clear, oftentimes it goes to adjacent properties first before it hits the public right of way. That's an Arlington, not Arlington specific, but that's, an artifact of how Arlington developed over time. There wasn't this comprehensive drainage plan for subdivisions. It was lot by lot or block by block. And so we do have a dynamic where a lot of runoff goes to other properties first.
At the bottom of the hill.
Yeah.
Goes downhill. Okay. Thank you. I don't know if that was at all helpful, but thank you. Susan?
If I can tag onto that a little bit, I think what you're hearing is the natural desire to have a model that's perfectly balanced, that allows us to say, if we add 4 trees here, it's the same value as taking away 2 sidewalks there. And I know we've done some of that work, and of course it's not perfect, but in the stormwater utility 1.0, we attempted to model what has the most impact and what has the most value. I think what you're hearing from the initial questions here is across lot coverage, impermeable surfaces, trees, little trees, grass, like all those different elements, we want to be able to better understand the value of them, both in terms of stormwater and other climate elements, and the cost or the avoided cost of them. And recognizing that's not going to be a perfect analysis, I think that's really what we're trying to get to, is for what we know now in the community we're living in and the climate we're living in now, what are those trade-offs? And then how might that change the policy and regulation we have about how important it is to preserve a tree versus hold your water on site in a concrete basin versus don't do the development at all. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I'm hearing.
Thank you. Takas?
Yes, a couple of things. There are clarifying questions. So when we talk in the initial slides, the first 10, about total impervious cover, does this include impervious cover of streets and, non-private, public right-of-way? Because it says building footprints have both increased, but total impervious cover, if we are talking only about residential impervious cover.
He's looking at slide 12, I think.
Slide 12, this one?
On R6, yes.
R6,
So
yep.
total impervious cover is not, that doesn't include streets and everything else that's impervious, right?
Correct.
It's only residential.
These slides, think about it, are within the lot lines of our 6 lots only,
Yeah.
not the public piece.
Personally, just for my edification, I would love to have, at some point, if it's available, what is the actual total impervious cover? Because I always think that, what we have paved over, the famous paving over paradise, right? So
right.
we literally started with paving before building.
Yeah.
The second thing is, in these slides where we have R6, R10, R5, do we account, or is the data telling us anything about non-conforming lots? Because they both, especially R6 and R10, have a lot of non-conforming lots. Some of them are legacy built because they're smaller, some are affordable, they have been built first. So do we have any data about, is that significant? I know that there are several, it's an unusual high number of non-conforming lots. It just doesn't have to be answered yet now.
Yep.
And then The last thing is, so in current literature, the expansion of patios is seen. It's a universal phenomenon across the nation. So the houses are getting bigger because of a ton of reasons, and then the external patio is now considered a part of the value of the home. So it's not like a secondary thing.
They call it an outdoor room.
Yeah, it's an outdoor room. It's like and this may account, I mean, just editorializing here, this may account of, the tendency to add this value now, in the latest years and recently, rather than not doing that in the past. So that's my take on that. And I've seen that in many places.
Thank you. Maureen?
Thanks. I'll start with maybe a history question. I think to me it's intuitive why we wanted to incentivize front porches for community purposes, but what was the rationale for providing an additional 5 percentage points of lot coverage for a detached garage?
I'm looking to Anthony to,
Yeah.
Mr. Fusarelli.
I thought that might be a Mr. Fusarelli question.
I think that's an excellent question, and I think it's got a lot to do with history.
Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, Anthony Fusarelli with the Planning Division. So it was, I think, 2005, the last time the county board approved amendments to how the zoning ordinance regulates lot coverage. On the specific question for that 5% increase for detached, it's our understanding based on research on the discussions at that time from an urban design perspective, there was an interest in having detached garages placed further back from the street right of way, as opposed to built into the main structure closer to the street. An urban design consideration that at that time led to the inclusion of the 5% allowance, if you would, recognizing that you'd need a longer driveway and you'd need additional areas counted as coverage to be able to achieve that urban design objective instead of just building the garage into the main structure, itself.
Gotcha. So that no real environmental consideration, mostly a design preference at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think as was mentioned earlier, those are decisions that involve trade-offs, right? And so there may have been environmental considerations, but the trade-off that in that particular instance, the preference for having that urban design goal achieved, also recognizing there's more coverage associated with it.
Great, thank you. And then maybe a little bit more directly related, do we have any sense of I really like the year built graphs. I think those are really helpful to visualize. But do we have any sense of over time the proportion of new builds by year that have taken one of those kind of bonuses or combined the bonuses? Has it increased over time? Is almost everyone taking them now when before it was maybe partial sometimes? Do we have any sense of that kind of trend over time?
do you want to say something first?
That can also be a comeback later.
No, we might have a resource here.
Yes.
Welcome.
Afternoon. I walked all the way over here to say no.
Okay.
But we just don't track it at that level. But I think anecdotally, right, we see more people pushing building to the maximum.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons, but we're not collecting that data that we can share.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's fine. I'm just wondering the extent to which that's playing into the expansion of coverage that we see in some of these graphs. And then another question, thank you, I think that's all though. Another question that I think may have been embedded in some of my colleagues' questions, but I'm not sure I quite caught exactly if we answered it. On the graphs of, our percentages here, we've got the blue, the red, and the green. From an environmental perspective and in terms of the actual impact of the impervious area, do we, overall, and maybe there's some nuance here, but I think mostly speaking broadly, do we consider that the environmental impact of those three categories is pretty much the same regardless which category it's in? Are there higher impacts of, building versus driveway? Is there, how do those things relate to each other? Or does it really, from an environmental standpoint, not matter what the impervious surface is? It's just the fact that it is impervious.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's sort of a yes and. It does matter, and I think what matters even more, and we're going to get into this, is how much pervious space you have left on the lot. Because I think we talked about this before, like if a lot is 80% impervious and 20% of that is a patio, but if you make the patio permeable, there's some stormwater benefits there, but you're still losing plantable space for trees. And so I think we can manage impacts from those different surfaces with stormwater tools. Where we start to struggle, and I think it's what we're going to get at the next parts of the presentation, is when that remaining pervious space to multitask it for stormwater and tree planting and other things is diminishing, and then your ability to manage it is compromised.
Okay. Got
Could I follow up with one? It's always seemed to me that roofs, houses with good gutter systems that come down and capture the water, it's easier to control it and monitor it, I see heading on the back, than the patio, catching the patio. So for that reason, it seems to me that a house with a good gutter system and stuff would probably be better, but I'll just toss that off, getting sort of head nods, we don't have to.
Yeah, sure.
Takas, you had another question?
Yeah,
I think Matt does as well, and maybe Susan.
Just quickly, this is a follow-up to Maureen's question. So there are different levels of perviousness. So for example, if we have pervious pavers, this is not 100%, so it is like 50 or less than that. But there is perviousness, but it's not, we are not capturing that. I don't imagine that we are, measuring. We lose the plantable space. It can be remediated because you can leave space for a tree to be planted there. But in general, this is reduction of the perviousness of the area. This is not unmitigated green space, right? But we don't capture that. So the data that we have from the stormwater fee authority, for the stormwater management authority, are not helpful for that, or are they?
Well, it's sort of a yes and no. One way I explain it, when you look at sort of stormwater management calculations like we do for the LDA program, a pervious driveway is first considered impervious for calculation purposes. And then the perviousness of it is a mitigation factor that's applied on that side of the ledger. So if the lot, no, it's impervious, but then it's mitigated. The data that's captured, like through GIS, is going to show it as impervious, if that's what you're asking.
Okay.
As a surface. But the mitigation of that impervious by the perviousness nature, the pervious, for example, pervious pavers is a mitigating factor. As you said, not 100% offsetting it, both stormwater and otherwise, because it's still not pervious space and it doesn't eliminate all the impacts. Does that help?
Yeah, it does, because what I've seen, in practice is that a lot of people are changing their driveways to gravel, for example, and then they do the patio. So they try to play, they game it, and they actually reduce perviousness. And another significant thing is that, water goes through that, but what even the lack or the loss of perviousness is also accelerating the discharge. So we get maybe less water, but faster down the system, and that's also very problematic. Thank you.
Yeah, Matt.
Chance I missed this, I could use a refresher. The data on slide with the red, blue, green, and purple, how do we know that? Or what's the data source? Because like 1900, 1910.
Oh, the first one? This one
Yeah.
here?
And a couple of the,
Page 10, 12.
12 and 13, like I was speculating, is that property my impression of the courthouse property records is that they're completely unsearchable. I don't know, maybe now,
They're in cool old books.
or now PDFs, but, they were and there's some of them. So how do we get that data?
Where do we get the storm?
Yeah.
So stormwater utility. So each part, we have a record for every parcel.
Yeah.
And it has a year built date, right? So that's one piece of this. But what the stormwater utility did, the staff and our geographic information system, is they digitized the impervious surfaces on every lot to then determine it's.
Even that far back.
So they correlate.
The lots, think
So
of
the
it this
dots
way.
are what they look like today by the year that they were built.
By the year they were built.
Correct.
Okay,
That makes more sense.
Yes, that's the
Yes.
clarifier.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
what's a little, yeah.
great, thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
good question.
Susan?
We may be getting to this a little bit later, but kind of, again, back to the trade-offs question. So I think we asked the question about, it's not exactly 0-1, a paved surface versus a plot of grass, for instance. It's not like one's completely impermeable and one's fully permeable. Likewise, for the gravel driveways, I think that's often a pain point for folks because it feels somewhat permeable, but the national engineering data says it's not permeable enough, right? Is there a way that we can get to making those trade-offs more elegantly in the stormwater utility data, in the policy data eventually, so that we could say, if your lot is sloped, it's a little different than if it's flat. If it is gravel, you get partial credit versus just asphalt. I think that's what, both from a policy perspective and helping the community make the right choices, and then from individual landowners or occupants' perspective, they want to know what the right thing to do is, and then be told they got it right, and celebrated for it. Is there anything you can say about that? Is that sort of a technology limitation? I know in the first year of the program, we had to have some set of rules. Are we able to flex that more as we go forward? And how might that fit back into our policy decisions?
It's a good question. I can't answer all those questions myself. I think that's obviously the utility folks have a lot to say about it too. And I think it's clearly being captured here as a question. So there's that. I think what I can say, just as an example, like gravel driveways, we think about the state code and what it says about an impervious surface. And it says, for example, any compacted dirt or gravel surface, right, that prevents infiltration. So, if a car is driving on a gravel driveway, it's probably pretty compacted versus like a engineered pervious driveway system that prevents that compaction but still allows the water to soak in. So there's trade-offs like that, and I think to a certain extent the utility looked to the stormwater program to help inform some of these policy decisions about what's pervious and what's impervious, for example. But that granularity you're talking about, that is a big question. I think it's being captured. I can't answer all that. Could we take it farther than yes, no, pervious, impervious is what I'm hearing you ask.
Right. And then I think back to the tree side of it. Is a big tree with a bunch of roots and a nice understory under it, is it doing more for stormwater than grass? Yes, it is. Can we calculate that and therefore help people make decisions about whether to take everything out and put, a storm catchment concrete structure where you can't then plant a tree back versus preserving that tree and at least roughly estimating that is better than it would be to take it out. I think that's what the community is kind of eager for us to figure out how to regulate and to allow.
Great. One more, because I do want to move on. All right, one more little one, yeah.
I forgot. So on slide 4, where you have the growth in impervious surface area by LDA regulated versus the nearly 70% that is not LDA regulated, can you share a little bit about what is within that 70% that we're not regulating by LDA?
Yeah. Well, I can sort of share it by exclusion in a sense.
Okay.
So let me go to this slide here. So you have this regulatory threshold of land disturbance, 2,500 square feet. And when you look at, the data in terms of what we regulate in the residential space, it's almost exclusively new homes.
Okay.
Very few home additions unless they're significant. You're not just adding something in the back, you might be reconfiguring the house and doing something with the driveway. Very few additions are regulated, exceed that threshold. So by exclusion, you're looking at, well, most home addition activity and also kind of hardscaping activity as well, driveway work or walkway or patio work. And then, it's primarily that. And I don't have, we have not done a deep dive. We know we regulate, we heard it earlier, about 300 projects a year under the LDA program. It's thousands of projects that get permits for additions and those sorts of things.
Interesting.
But we haven't done a deep dive into what that exclusion is, other than to know it's these things below the threshold.
Okay, yeah, I just think that's interesting because it's
a lot.
obviously a sizable, more than 2/3 of the growth, so.
Yep. All right. Thank you. I do want to say, when Takas asked the question about our own roads, and we had this conversation about technology, I'm remembering one of my very last conversations with Eric Gutschall. Because Eric and I actually sort of, we were talking about doing this kind of a study. We were kind of all set, and then the pandemic happened and Eric died, and it took a long time to get us back to here, so I'm glad we're here. One of the things that I'm remembering is that he was showing pictures of what I had actually seen in Germany of roads in section where under the roads is a catchment system. So it looks like pavement, but it all goes into this catchment system and slowly drains away. So those kind of technological solutions, and maybe for driveways and things, are something that we can be, I'm assuming they get improved all the time. But I kind of wanted to channel Eric and at least bring out that point for us to be considering as we move forward. So, because he had a lot to do to want to have this discussion. All right.
Bioretention was his middle name.
Bioretention was his middle name. Thank you. I think we're ready to go on.
Okay, and just to note, we do not have 167 slides to cover. This is my.
Oh, I had missed that. I did check it out last night. It wasn't that bad.
Only 162.
You are, yeah, what are you, like, we're 6% along here. No, we're doing
All right.
Okay, all right. So the other thing, other data that we looked at, and this is one of the questions that we asked, wanted to look at the data. What proportion of impervious surfaces are from surface area that are from surfaces that don't count as lot coverage? So in other words, this walkways and patios piece, what are we looking at here? And if you look at the combined footprint, it's pretty significant. So this is all residential lots, the whole data set. It's 13% of all the impervious area. And of the paved area, it's more than a third. And I think if you've heard me talk about impervious area in the past, I like to use the Pentagon as a measure, the footprint of the Pentagon. How many Pentagons does it represent? It's 7 Pentagons. So I think you can think about that.
That's incredible.
It's pretty significant. Yeah. So, the takeaways that these surfaces, this is the main takeaways, I think, when I look at it. They're the most discretionary of uses on a residential lot. Obviously, you have a house, you have to have a house, you have to have a driveway. That's also a requirement. But these are more discretionary. And what we've seen in the data is they're pushing impervious area above lot coverage limits. And while it's of course important that the impervious area, added by these surfaces, it adds stormwater impact. What we're talking about next, it's really important that the remaining pervious areas on these lots are limited and fragmented. So that's what we're going to talk about next is, what happens with what's left.
Say that again. What's mainly important is, can you repeat that sentence?
Yeah, that the remaining, it's really important to think about, and we're going to talk about this next, the remaining pervious areas are fragmented. They're limited and they're fragmented.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk about why that matters as well. Sorry, I didn't say that very well, so thanks for having it clarified. So that's the next focus of this presentation, the importance of these pervious areas to achieve stormwater management and urban forestry objectives. Oh, and it's not advancing. 1 second here. Okay. So we're asking, in a sense, the remaining pervious areas on these lots to do a lot of things. That's where stormwater management happens, where the facilities that manage runoff or rainfall and runoff are absorbed, what we talked about with your question earlier, Libby, about what happens when you add more impervious. It's where we are looking to conserve existing trees and or plant new trees and expand canopy coverage over time. And then all the things that an owner wants and needs to do, landscaping and play equipment, decks and patios, utilities, and other things. So we're asking it to do a lot. And I'm going to turn it back over to Vincent for a couple slides to have him talk a little bit more about the importance of these pervious areas for trees.
Thank you. So this really ties back into this whole plantable space question, and it's really important to understand that their tree roots grow out in the top 2 feet of soil, sometimes a little bit farther, but usually in those top 2 feet. And they are not like palm trees, which you can just stick in a hole and expect to survive. They really need that space to spread those roots and explore that pervious space. So we need contiguous pervious space. It's not just a little fragmented space, as what Jason mentioned. We need contiguous pervious space to provide for the space to get mature trees, or at least healthy trees, in these spaces. And because some of this space is fragmented, and you'll see that in some examples that Jason has later on, a lot of the lot is unsuitable for planting trees. Some of these side yards that are really tight, or just kind of small fragmented spaces next to the driveway. It's usually the front yard and backyard spaces where the most of the opportunities lie. Next slide. So, some of this is repetitive. We're at 35% countywide tree canopy, and our goal is 40%. And some of these lower residential areas that we're talking about must achieve a higher canopy coverage. This speaks to Ms. Coffey's reference earlier on how we manage this across the county, and to manage the lower canopy in the denser areas. The Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments recommends about 50 to 55% tree canopy cover for these low to medium density residential spaces. Some of the denser lots may fall under the high density residential target of 35%, but that's still a significant part of the lot. And this tree canopy, if we aim to achieve it, needs that soil volume, not just quantity, but quality as well, and needs that soil volume to be unfragmented. We'll have to also look at the existing lots that aren't necessarily doing that, doing anything, and also look at them to provide additional planting through the tree canopy fund or other mechanisms.
Okay, thanks, Vincent. So what we've done, we put together a few schematics to show what we're talking about here, to show it in action. So here's an R6 lot. I chose a 75th percentile example to kind of think about as we start, pushing a little higher on some of these lots with impervious surfaces. This lot has about 50% impervious surface, but only about 25% of it's available for tree planting, not the other 50%. And what we've done here, working with Vincent and looking at data on, how much soil it can support a certain canopy area, we have identified these contiguous spaces with these brown rectangles and looked at that soil area and then correlated it to a future tree canopy potential over time. The growth of that canopy is going to be limited by the available soil space for the roots, as Vincent just laid out. So in this example, this lot would support about 40% tree canopy. And as Vincent said, if we're looking at more like 50 or 55% in these residential areas, and remember our 6 lots are the most numerous by a significant margin, then this suggests we might fall short. And it's a little small on the bottom there, but if you look at an older home, also in the 75th percentile, so in that baseline period that we looked at, 1935 to 1960, it's about 40% impervious, about 40% of the lots available for planting, and it could support about 60% tree canopy. So there's some contrast there. And we're talking about this is potential space for trees. It's often reduced in reality because we talked about there's other needs for that space. Stormwater management features, for example, we've got dry wells shown here. These are underground features that are filled with gravel where ultimately as we manage the runoff through various means, for example, stormwater planters or stormwater tanks, dry wells are the place where that water is kind of, if you will, translated from a point source to diffuse it and also soak it into the ground, and there could be some potential conflicts. And those can't be located just anywhere. They can't be too close to the house, they can't be too close to neighbors, and we want the lot to manage its runoff as much as possible and not necessarily push it to other lots. So, and then if you have a patio, and we'll talk more about this, a patio that's added later, that wasn't included in the, in the considerations in the development, that's also another potential conflict area for trees. And then utilities as well, I show water and sewer lines, another potential source of location conflict. So that's how, so the canopy potential is there. It's limited even, with this newer home situation, but then it often gets reduced. And when we look at R10, there's a little more planting space here. And in this example, again, this is a newer home lot. This has, when we looked at this analysis, the potential to support at least 50% tree canopy. The story's a little bit better here than it was for the R6 lot, keeping in mind that R6 lots are more numerous. But there's just more space here, and I think it shows. And again, though, that canopy potential can be reduced. These are actual examples, by the way. So here you have, again, stormwater management facilities, in this case, not just a dry well, but a rain garden. This particular lot has a public storm drain pipe that runs through it as well, and then private pipes as well. So there are these additional, again, these competing demands for limited and fragmented pervious spaces. To sum up what we just walked through, there's this limited plantable space on new home lots for trees. This limitation can grow with additional impervious surfaces, like a new patio that might be added later. And then achieving the county's long-term tree canopy targets can be, or will be especially difficult in these R6 zones as these lots develop over time. Okay, so we've talked about this, and I want to spend a few minutes highlighting a dynamic that's compounding these stormwater management and urban forestry challenges that we've talked about, and that is adding impervious surfaces after a new home is built. And what we see on the stormwater side is that this can undermine the public purposes of the LDA program. You're creating new and uncontrolled runoff impacts to adjacent properties, the county storm drain system, and also streams. And in the stormwater program, we have only limited tools to try to mitigate these impacts. They can't actually prevent it or prohibit it, and there's currently no county permit to review these activities proactively. So that's just a challenge I wanted to...
Say that again.
No county permit to review these activities proactively. Thank you, Mark.
Everybody got that?
Everybody got that?
Mark.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to run through these examples, and we're getting there. We are well more than halfway. I won't call it out on each example, but just on the first one, you've got the impervious coverage of the lot as it exists now in the upper left. For reference, I have zoning lot coverage just referenced there as well for the zone. So you have 60% impervious here with a lot that added a patio in the back compared to when it was built. Again, another situation like this, 65% impervious. Here's one that's 70% impervious. Again, you can see what was done post LDA, 51% impervious. In the last two examples, this is an oversized lot. So it's R6, but it's pretty large, almost 9,000 square feet. So it's a large area added, but there's also a lot of green space left. So, there are some scenarios where it's not as bad overall, but again, none of this was accounted for in the stormwater mitigation for that project. And then here's an R10 lot, also oversized, but a patio ad in the back, and it's still pretty significant coverage of a lot that large, 43%. And I want to make sure everyone understands that this also can happen on existing lots and older lots, that again, paving of lots that is not regulated can occur over time, and it can get pretty significant. These are some examples where it got pretty high. It's gotten pretty high over time. All right, so.
All right.
We got another break for questions.
Yes, Susan, we'll start with you. Go ahead.
Sorry, could we just walk through those two examples again? My jaw was hitting the floor.
It may not be as easy. It may not be as easy for us to understand what we're seeing for you possibly. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, back to maybe. R6, the one that's 51%. I think it's one more.
This one?
Yeah, can you just tell us what's happening there? I can't quite
Yeah, it's
tell.
not the greatest visually. Is my cursor showing?
Yes.
No, it isn't, right?
It's showing.
There it is. So it's a patio in the back. It happens to be like, I think it's terracotta.
I see. Got
I don't
it.
want to underdo these slides if they're visually impactful, but if there's stuff that wasn't obvious, definitely want to go back.
So it's nothing in the front, it's just that patio, but it
Yeah,
looks
the
like
patio,
dirt from here.
correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And that's 4 years later, so somebody changed their mind or won the lottery or whatever. But the next one is 4 months, 8 months after, 6 months, I can't
This
remember.
one.
Yeah, talk about what's happening there.
Tell us about what might be going through this developer / homeowner's mind.
It's homeowner. And you can see, so what we're seeing is, and this is not uncommon, and builders tend not to build decks or patios with the project. The homeowner might want to do either. So what we will see, though, is this nice sliding glass door to a little landing and a step down to the, and we did a tour recently with the county manager as well and kind of saw that actually happening. We see a lot of that. And so it's there, it's what they submitted to be reviewed and approved, but then post-construction, it's sold. Sometimes these are, not speculative. The owner is the one doing the building, but a lot of times they are. But when it's sold, the owner then looks at, as you were talking about, the outdoor space and what they want to do there as well. So I think generally what's happening is just the natural inclination to develop your outdoor space on your lot.
Okay, but it's a brand-new house that's built in the same year that the back is built, and it takes some time to design and procure. So it's unlikely this was a spontaneous surprise.
Right.
And may, in fact, be driven by how we set our permit fees and limitations, right?
But we can't limit
Oh,
or
but
anything.
the
You
thing,
wouldn't know that.
we can spend some more time later on this, and you can actually ask us to follow up on it, but this particular parcel we were on, right now, there is no regulatory tool for us to do it. That doesn't mean we don't have the authority to put in a regulatory tool. There just isn't one right now.
But there is, if they were to do there's an incentive to not do the two projects at the same time currently, right? Because the LDA disturbance of all of it would have been considered. Is that correct?
Right, to exclude it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's correct.
Yep. So people may be behaving rationally.
Right, so it's 2,400, they don't trigger it. They would trigger it if they had the patio, so they build it, don't trigger it, and then you add the patio and it doesn't trigger it.
No, in this case, I
How
would
it
guess they
works?
triggered it in April because that's a big
Yeah,
construction
they
project.
did trigger it, but didn't include the patio in the original LDA,
Okay.
whether intentionally or otherwise. Either way, it's
Just didn't
just not
happen.
included.
Yeah, okay. Susan, anything else on right now?
For now.
Okay, thank you. Matt, something?
No questions on this part. I'll wait.
Okay, no, that's fine. Maureen, your light's on?
Yeah, I'm conscious that I see no attorneys at the table, but I am interested in our authority in terms of creating a new process, expanding an existing process. Like, I think in particular, the slide of some of the, like the older lot that went to 91%. I mean, we all have to agree that that is not a healthy environmental.
Okay, so I understand what your question is. I'm going to ask both Vincent and Jason to offer their thoughts about how would one go about doing that. The question about the legal basis for doing that, they're not qualified to answer, but I know they both have given some thought to this. Let you go first.
I feel like I'm boxed in here a little bit. No, I will not.
Go ahead in a minute. This is your house, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, you're all invited over for the pool party.
There's plenty of space.
Yeah, there's plenty of space for everybody. Well, I think the way we've looked at it is about setting some guardrails around how much of a lot you can pave, right? And at the end of the presentation, we kind of tee up some thoughts for consideration about next steps. But I think fundamentally it's that. What I would say is thinking about it in a stormwater mitigation space, in our view, is not the most cost effective. I think ounce of prevention, pound of cure. There's a lot of overhead with regulating it as a stormwater process. Plans, construction, post-construction, monitoring, all those things. There's overhead no matter how we do this, and I think that's something we would look at the pros and cons of. I'm just noting, like, I think there's something in prevention that is always better than mitigation. So that's I don't know if that's a response you were looking for, but I think that's how I think about it.
You're not a lawyer, remember?
You're not
I'm not a
I
lawyer.
get it.
I definitely am not.
Obviously, I see this as no plantable space. The capacity for this property to provide the ecosystem services that we're looking for, even let alone the stormwater benefits, is probably nil. Maybe some stormwater gets captured in the pool, but that's a different question. Yeah, this puts that burden on the neighbors and the neighborhood to provide those ecosystem services, because those are not optional.
Right.
And that's the balance that we're looking at here, is like, yeah, obviously you need a house where you're required to have a driveway, okay, but what goes beyond that is really the question.
Yeah.
And I would add, and I know I've had a slight variation of this conversation with Mr. Richardson, And so one of the things you could task us to do, along with the county attorney, is to come back and say, what are the potential options to approach that? I'm not going to say there are no options. I think there are options, and the question is which would be the best of a series of tools is something that I think is worthy of consideration.
And how would you phrase that? Options to approach prevention instead of mitigation? Is that what do you see what I'm saying? I'm trying. How?
I mean, I think I'm just very conscious of, to me, at least, the purpose of public policy and regulation is to intervene in things where there is a public cost to private action. And I think this is an example of that, right? Like Mr. Verwey said, the neighbors are the ones who are going to have to take on the environmental mitigation of someone's individual cost. And so, how is it that we balance individual choice with the fact that your individual choices are harming your neighbors?
Yeah. In other words, think about if every neighbor on the street wanted to do that.
Right. That would be unsustainable and drastically harm the overall community.
Okay. More questions? I think we're ready to move on?
We are getting there. Okay.
Yep, let's go.
So the last part of today's presentations provide some highlights of actions taken over the past, I can't believe it's been 30 years, but the past 30 years to mitigate the impacts of impervious surfaces. So this is kind of a thumbnail sketch, but this includes a combination of regulatory activities that the county delivers, codes and ordinances, as well as regulations we're required to meet, like our MS4 permit. And I also want to highlight here that the county board over the years, when given the choice, has chosen options to exceed minimum state requirements. So for example, under the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance, they designated all streams as RPA, Resource Protection Area, even though it's only required to do it for perennial streams. They added steep slopes adjacent to the RPA, which is also discretionary. And even regulating individual single-family homes itself, that is discretionary under state code. It's not required. But the board chose to do that because of the dynamics we see in Arlington with those properties developing and the impervious surfaces. So there's been these forks in the road, and the board has often chosen to take the fork with the most authority that they can choose. And then most recently in 2021, with the board's support, we added the management of stormwater quantity in addition to water quality for single-family homes as regulated under the LDA program. And we touched on this a little earlier. One of the actions taken on that long list is the reduction of lot coverage in 2005. So it was 56% uniform. It was reduced. It would lower with 2 lower coverage caps for each zoning district, total coverage and main building footprint. So yes, there's that bonus for the detached garage, which has pros and cons that we talked about a little bit earlier. But overall, there was a reduction in a uniform, higher coverage at that time. Okay, closing. See, 46 out of 167. So I'm going to start wrapping up here with these main conclusions. So we've discussed here today that, larger, newer homes leading to less remaining pervious space to meet a range of public and private needs. The compounding effect of adding paved surfaces after new homes are built. The overall potential for paved surfaces to expand across all residential lots without guardrails. And the significant efforts that have occurred to mitigate what the stormwater and urban forestry programs can control. And what this tees up here is, we end here with some possible actions to consider to set limits for paving and covering of lots along with a range of trade-offs to examine with these potential actions for discussion here and beyond.
All right, that was the mic drop moment. Thank you. Colleagues, questions to go? Marcus?
There's not a question, it's just a so sincere appreciation for the presentation of the food for policy thought here, and some initial demonstration of how complex the issue is, because after all these are significant investments. They are in a place that is owned by private people that have expectations from these investments, etc. So this is all happening in a delicate and complex environment. So the articulation of the environmental, stormwater-related, tree canopy-related liabilities here is absolutely clear. But there are also other things, right? So I really appreciate this. I just, my only addition to that is I would like to see how the rest of the Impervious system, works with that. And this is, I anticipate that we will have a conversation not only, and we are having it already, not only how we mitigate on these lots, on the residential lots, but also in the public right-of-way and beyond that. These two processes have to go together. But other than that, thank you very much. This is really very helpful for me.
Okay. Susan, Matt? I have a question. Maybe I'll just go ahead and ask it if that's all right. And could you elaborate a little bit more on reducing allowable building footprints and what that means, what that would mean? I mean, I understand sort of, but how do you see that playing out?
I think in this space, and we kind of put these as potential options, that if you were looking at different things you could do to limit overall impervious surfaces, you could look at just paved surfaces or just some of them and setting new limits or including them, or also look at building footprints too, which are also, governed under zoning as well. So it's just putting it in here as, there's a range of things that could be looked at against these trade-offs that we also list here as well as some possible trade-offs to evaluate.
Okay. Susan? Thank you.
And that's what we did as a board in 2005, was we dropped the building lot, or main building lot coverage as part of the solution. I was just going to ask, obviously this looks hard, or we would have done it already. So who's the magical jurisdiction that's done it really well that we can learn from? Has anyone else scaled this mountain?
I started looking at, but very superficially, like what other jurisdictions do. And I got quickly lost in some of the zoning codes, to be honest with you, because, it's complicated because it is. I do know, Anthony and I were talking briefly about it. DC has, I think, a green area ratio, for example. That may be one place to look for inspiration or ideas. Certain portions of lots have to be covered by green space. So that's a possibility there. I have not yet looked farther afield in detail, though, about who's really gone farther in this space. What I will say is I feel like our single-family home dynamics are pretty unique. In other words, the intensity of the demand for those lots, the turnover and what the building potential is, and the proportion of land that those areas represent, I don't think is the norm in a lot of places. Mm-hmm. But I think we see it here as our most intense kind of incremental change in stormwater, right? These large areas that are single family are getting more impervious surfaces. And I'm not sure how common that is even around the region, but if not beyond.
Interesting. Would Boston be similar? That just pops into mind as something that may be a little bit more like us. I don't know. Mark, you should know that better than I.
I don't. I thought about it because I was just up there this past weekend. I don't think there was really an urban, the intensity of development with the mix of residential neighborhoods as part of that. I'm hard pressed to think of I don't think there is an analogous situation up in Boston.
Oh, good. Where are you?
One thing I did want to add, and this is so unscripted, but I wanted to respond to one of the points that was raised by Takis, and this is just an observation, which is that when we went back and looked, and I think that staff spent a lot of time looking at how the board ended up where it ended up in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, that journey started 15 years before that, or probably even longer, and there was a lot of conversation in the community. It went on for an extended period of time. I encourage you to speak to your former board colleagues about that. And I will say one of the last conversations I had with Eric Gutschall was when we were looking at permit parking, residential permit parking. And I bring this up as an example. The number of cars that we let residents park on streets as opposed to driveways, okay? And we talked to him also about street width and talking about things like, and where we have power lines and whether we require them to be buried or not. These are all interrelated. And I remember saying to him, we can go through so many levels of analysis and make this so complicated that we'll never get anywhere, which is what I think is what happened last time. The board spent 15 years analyzing it. So the reason why we chose to start here is it's hard enough right here. It will have implications that I'm not sure we're able to answer. If you want us to go back and study them, we're happy to do that. But I would like you to think about putting a cap on the type of analysis we do, because the consequences, and I'm going to let Jason and Vincent talk about this, are unforeseen. What we saw here is the board made a genuine good faith effort in 2005 to come up with lot limits. And what we have now, nobody, as far as I know, looked at this idea of fragmented spaces. It just wasn't foreseen. So you can study it as much as you want at a certain place, but sometimes you're just going to have to take a good faith action and then see what happens. But that's just my thought.
Thank you. Matt?
Thank you. I definitely think that words like non-conforming, prospective, and retrospective, I think those, legalistic terms, I'd really love to understand those before, between now and when we engage next on this, because I don't want to spend 15 years on this at all. And so walkways and patios, very interested, and I want to understand that more, because that seems like a different level of emphasis than we have had in the last.
And if I could just add on non-conforming, and I'm going to encourage maybe, not Arlova, but someone to comment on this. Last time when the board took an action and they passed certain things, certain lots became non-conforming, and there are financial implications with that. When you want to go to a bank and get a mortgage, your mortgage expanded to do buildings, that puts, I don't want to say a cloud, but it changes some of the financial aspects of it. So that gets really, you need to have lawyers talking to you about that. I mean, our county attorney, obviously, so.
Well, that's probably half our population, but in addition to we need to hear from our county attorney in addition. So, I mean, I'm very interested in the walkways and patios, and on the other pieces, I want to understand more. I do think equity and administration and enforcement are key pieces that I'd be looking towards going forward. Thanks.
Maureen?
Okay, great. I've been scribbling away on my notes here. I think in terms of the possible options to evaluate, I think I'm interested in those, but would add or throw out a couple of other things to consider. One is the impact that removing the bonus coverage option of detached garage, what impact that would have and what that would look like. The second is if we're able to have incentives for things like detached garages, is there a way to include incentives for other goals such as stormwater management, mature trees, preservation of existing green space? I'd be interested in knowing that. I've looked at DC's green area ratio. I actually think it's quite intriguing because it doesn't count all green space identically. So mature trees get more bonus density essentially or bonus coverage than grass does. We know grass is not as good for the environment as trees are. And so I think it creates a nice formula for people to look at. And then I think within one of the in terms of including walkways and patios as lot coverage, I just would be interested in if we can figure out some way to present how we think that would actually impact home size and square footage, whether we think that, I could see that going a lot of different ways. Is it just that people don't build a patio, but they still build a building that is 37% lot coverage? Or is it that they, do a building that's 30% lot coverage and then a patio that's 7% lot coverage? I think it matters to me what that impact looks like in terms of how we think the architecture would evolve and building would evolve. And so I think those are my three areas that I didn't necessarily see represented in the potential actions and trade-offs that I would be additionally interested in talking about.
Thank you. Susan?
I'm interested in the administration and enforcement bullet here, and I think what I heard potentially in the presentation that LDA and all the stormwater elements, while useful, are a lot of administrative burden to manage, and they go on forever. It's not just a building permit. You've got to still check in on it. So I'm pretty interested in some of the cost trade-offs here of what we're doing now and how could we simplify that going forward so that it is more of an incentive or more of a third-party, certification that doesn't burden our teams forever, and how we might expand that a little bit. So I think it goes back to that question of, can we monetize, can we quantify both the cost and the benefit of various pieces here so that we get the right mix and manage our own budgets and time as well as our residents.
Yeah, I would add LDA 1.0, the different, and Greg can correct me if I'm wrong, 2.0 was meant to try to create some templates for residents to figure out how to do things more easily. So we did try to do that. The challenge becomes once LDA 2.0, once it's done and the permit is granted and we walk away, what happens then with the enforcement?
Right. Takis?
We have definitely, we need to have a better understanding of the actual urban form that fits and that can find and I agree with Ms. Coffey on this, that where we can find the beneficial balances and the beneficial trade-offs, right? This is very, very clear. There are powerful economic reasons why we are where we are. If you want to finance a $2.5 million home, you better have the square footage that somehow convinces your loan officer to give you that, even if you are fully 100% creditworthy. So this is, to me, an important thought on this. The regulatory regime about the annexes, the additions, the patios, et cetera, is, to me, really interesting. I think that we cannot afford anymore to continue with this being completely free-for-all. Yeah, and having the Stormwater Authority now, we have actually an access to the data and to the evolution of that, right? It's not so difficult anymore. We don't have to police the entire. I mean, we have an incoming information about all this. Other than that, I agree with the list here. The issue of non-conforming properties and future non-conforming properties is a real hard legal issue. It's not that we don't have enough today. We have a lot of non-conforming properties. I was actually very surprised how many, especially under R6 and especially under R10. So that's another challenge that we need to look into, and we probably need good legal advice on how to proceed there.
Okay. Susan, more? So I'm trying to put together what I'm hearing. I think y'all are taking notes too. So everybody, this is sort of what I'm coming up with. I think there's a desire to look at the green area ratio in DC and what that's doing. Give us a little bit more background on how that might apply here possibly. I think there's a definite desire to look at the regulatory framework and that we don't have and that we should put in on the walkways, patios, and driveways. I think there's definite interest in doing that. I'd like to toss into that, I won't be here, but if we do some regulation, if there are ways of providing more support on how people might do a patio that that provides stormwater management and actually use the gutters, just maybe more help for residents on stormwater management with what techniques are out there. I think I heard a desire to look at, do we want to change this bonus option, the detached garage? Do we want to get out of that? Is that correct? And then I'm not quite sure how to express this one. It is just sort of to look at the cost trade-offs we've got. Can we, to simplify what we're doing now, we have LDA 2.0. Is there an LDA 3.0 that might include some more enforcement? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to phrase that, but there seems to be some interest in looking at when what we're doing, that may fit actually just into the walkway, patio, and driveway section.
Yeah, at least, and I'm going to ask Ms. Cunningham if she can clarify a little bit. What I heard there was, to the extent that we have a regulatory scheme that has lots of inspectors doing lots of things, is that the best way to spend that money? Not that we're opposed to regulating it, but if that money were spent in another way, could it achieve the same result? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it's just trying to have some transparency, both in the benefit of any of these things and the cost. So recognizing they may change over time, but the regulation's not free.
Okay. Does that catch everything, you guys? Does that give you a little bit to go on, Mr. Schwartz?
It does. So we'll get back to you with we'll put together a list of this, and when we'll come back to you with estimates of the time involved in doing that analysis. We'll speak to the county attorney, and we'll be in contact with you. I think it's going to take us a little while to get that together, but we'll be back to you with a more specific timeframe and some options. I'd say, what, January, February, something like that.
Sounds good. All right. Okay. I think with that, we're adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you very much. This was incredible work, you guys. I think you've both been promoted. You're both doctors now. Yeah, honorary.